All right, sweet babies, here we go. One of my favorite topics here when it comes to Social 30, and that is the establishment of communism in Russia and how ultimately it turned into a spectacular failure. So, what we're going to look at here, folks, is basically Lenin, the Bolshevik Party, the Russian Revolution, and how in 1922 we see the formation of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So let's check this out. Now, some essential background to the Russian Revolution. In the previous learning module, I put some information on there about how revolutions don't just happen, right? It takes a lot to push a people, Russian people, American people, French people, right? We've learned all about those revolutions. It takes a lot to push people to the point of wanting to tear down their government and bring something else to the forefront. And as it says, guys, you have to understand, like in Russia in the early 1900s, right? We're talking about the 1900s now. That's not that long ago. I mean, I was born in the 1900s. I know none of you were. If you're my students, but I mean, the 1900s didn't seem that long ago. Now, in the early 1900s, Russia was still ruled by a czar, and sometimes you'll see czar spelled C-Z-A-R or T-S-A-R. And yes, I said Z, right? We're Canadian, not Z. Anyways, so it's the early 1900s. Russia is still ruled by a czar. And most of the world by this time had cast off the shackles of feudalism. Most people said that feudalism really had no place in the world anymore. So we saw the American Rev in 1776, right? They basically said enough is enough to feudalism and they established their own republic. We see the same thing 13 years later in France in 1789, right? The people of France said enough is enough to their king, right? King Louis XVI and the Bourbon family there. And eventually what we get, of course, is the French Revolution in 1789. Now, guys, in Russia, it's the early 1900s, and Russia still looked like Russia had looked hundreds of years earlier, right? They had this family called the Romanovs who ruled over them, and it was just a constant dynasty of Romanov rulers. And you know, by the early 1900s, they've heard about these ideas or this idea called liberalism, and they wanted those freedoms. Yet in feudal Russia in the early 1900s, those freedoms were not given to them. So that autocratic rule that they're experiencing really didn't jive with them very much anymore. Now, continuing, you had a number of really poor people. It mentions on the slide here that the Russian aristocracy basically held all the land in Russia, and most people were very, very poor. Very poor. And if there's one thing that I know makes people angry, it's when people are poor and hungry. And guess what? In Russia, we had both of those things. Now, speaking of hunger, the next point on the slide talks about how there was a series of poor harvests in Russia. The climate of Russia is very similar to the climate of us here in Canada. Farming is very weather dependent. And, you know, if the gods bless you with good weather, then you'll have a great harvest and your people will eat in abundance. However, if, you know, for whatever reason, the weather doesn't cooperate, you get an early frost, you get a early snow, you get too much rain, you get not enough rain, you know, all these things contribute to a very sometimes unmanageable situation as far as agriculture is concerned. So it just so happens in the early 1900s, there had been a number of crop failures in Russia, just crop failure after crop failure. And that led to poor, starving people who became more and more desperate. And perhaps the most important factor leading to the ousting of the Tsar Nicholas II, was the fact that 1917, Russia had been a part of the Entente powers in World War One. The Entente powers included France and Great Britain. Of course, America joins right around 1917 as well. But guys, Russia was getting just hammered by the war. They gave more lives than any other Entente power. Nearly 2 million Russian soldiers were killed in the First World War. And the people eventually start to ask, why are we still here? So that led to the Tsar being very unpopular. People felt like the Tsar was just continually throwing young men's lives into the war front, and quite often these young men were told to go fight, and they were very ill-equipped, right? So the Tsar was rapidly falling out of favor. When you combine all these factors together, you get a situation where it is the perfect breeding ground for revolution. Now, Vladimir Lenin. So there he is right here. Guys, the big thing that we need to understand about Lenin, like any good leader, he was very charismatic. So Lenin was a great public speaker. The word oration means to be able to publicly speak. And the thing that Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik is the party that Lenin represented, right? The thing that Lenin and the Bolsheviks offered to the people of France was actually a very simple slogan, and that is peace, land, and bread. Now, I can't remember. Yeah, it was on the last learning module. I would have had the video of peace, land, and bread. And really, guys, it's a simple slogan that really rang to the hearts and minds of the people of Russia. Peace, because the war was slaughtering Russia's boys, right? Land, because the peasants had none, right? It was all controlled by the Tsar. And bread, because the people were hungry. Now, it also says on there, and to a lesser extent, potato liquor. Do you guys know what potato liquor is? We're talking about vodka, right? They love their vodka in Russia, but that's a joke, right? The slogan was peace, land, and bread. It had nothing to do with vodka, but in my brain, it makes it more interesting. So let's move on. All right, now, in 1917, we see a series of revolutions that occur in Russia. The first revolution happened in February of 1917, and we typically call this the Soldiers' Mutiny. So what happened is, as the people of Russia became more and more agitated, the Tsar Nicholas, started seeing more and more protests in the streets. It just so happened that at one of these protests, the Tsar ordered his soldiers, right? He's the leader of the country. He ordered his soldiers to put down the rebellion, and the soldiers refused. The word mutiny means to go against orders given to you. So with this soldier mutiny, what we see is basically it was indicative of the fact that the Tsar had lost the confidence of his soldiers. Now, when this happened, when the soldiers mutinied against the order of the Tsar, what happened is Nicholas II abdicates or gives up his throne, right? He basically takes off, right? And we'll get to more about that in a little while here. Now, the resultant effect of this was a provisional government comes to power, and it's known as the Kerensky Provisional Government. The word provisional just means temporary. Now, the cool thing about the Kerensky Provisional Government is after years and years, like 300 years of Tsarist Romanov rule, right, feudal rule, Russia in February of 1917 actually adopted a socialist, liberal, democratic government. Yes, Russia actually, for a brief time, from February to October of 1917, was technically on the path to liberal democracy, which is kind of incredible. A lot of students think that the Russian Revolution basically went like the Tsar right to the Bolsheviks, and that is actually skipping about 9 months of important history that, for a brief little while, right, 9 months, Russia flirted with democracy. Now, Lenin was not pleased with this. He believed that this wasn't going leftward enough, right? We know socialism is a left of center idea. We know that communism is a far left idea. So Lenin, being a Marxist, not happy. And then that eventually brings us to the October Revolution. Now, the October Revolution, ladies and gentlemen, that is what we typically think of when we think of the Russian Revolution. So in October of 1917, we see the event known as the Bolshevik Revolution. And this is where Lenin and his armed supporters, the Bolsheviks, lead a uprising against the provisional government. They storm the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, and it leads to Kerensky and the provisional government being kicked out of power. And now we see the establishment of communist rule in Russia. So this image right here, this is Alexander Kerensky. Originally, the provisional government was actually led by a different individual who ended up being very ineffective. However, Kerensky was, I think he was like the minister of the military or something like that. So he is the one who then assumed the power after the initial leader of the provisional government was sort of like removed from power. Now, this image here shows us an image of the Bolsheviks, some of the original Bolsheviks. And I like this image for a few reasons. Number one, you can see Vladimir Lenin there in the sort of middle, right? I got my pointer on him here. Notice he is wearing his beautiful Ushanka. We also have to his right, to his left, our right, we have a guy by the name of Leon Trotsky. We'll talk about him later. And we also see Lenin's successor. We see Joseph Stalin, and we'll talk more about him as well. Now, how did Lenin and the Bolsheviks establish control of the nation of Russia, and again lead to the formation of the Soviet Union? So what we're going to do here, guys, is we're going to talk about all of these different factors, with the exception of the Kronstadt revolt. I don't really care about a mutiny on a ship, but we will talk about all the other factors here. So let's move forward. So the first big change that we see in Russia once Lenin and the Bolsheviks take power is when the Bolsheviks were starting to try to gain power. In that 9 months that the Kerensky provisional government had power, they talked about this thing called the Constituent Assembly. If you remember, I said that for a brief 9-month period, the people of Russia were moving towards democracy, and this democracy was going to be a parliamentary body known as the Constituent Assembly. So Kerensky promises to form this democratic body that was going to represent the will of the people of Russia. And yeah, it was democratic. And after 300 years of Tsarist rule, this seemed like an awesome step forward. Now, straight after the October Revolution, October Revolution, again, this is where Lenin and the Bolsheviks gain power. Kerensky's ousted. Lenin promises to still hold these elections for the Constituent Assembly. Now, why would he do that? We know in the end, Lenin was a tyrant. We know that he was an autocrat. We know that, as a communist, he believed in the practice of like solidifying power in one party. Now, why would Lenin promise to hold elections for this parliamentary democratic body? And the answer to this is he believed the Bolsheviks were going to win the election, basically sweep it. And when you win a democratic majority government, you can basically do what you want anyways. So Lenin holds this election, and he also wants to appear to be a champion of the causes of the people. One of the things the people of Russia want is democracy. Now, ironically enough, I was reading a little bit about this morning, and there were reporters in Russia at that time observing the elections for the Constituent Assembly. And at that time, Russia, by some reporters, was being touted as the greatest democracy on earth. Now, when I think Russia, I do not think democracy. When I think Russia, I think of totalitarian government that represses its people. So anyways, during that election, guys, the Bolsheviks, right, the far left party, the communists, only won 168 seats out of 703. Clearly not enough for a majority, not even 25% of the seats in the Constituent Assembly. So what this causes Lenin to do is him and his Bolshevik supporters, through sheer force, basically dissolve the Constituent Assembly after 1 day of its existence, right? He says the Constituent Assembly, the way that the vote turned out, it is just another symptom of class oppression, right? This is just the bourgeois taking power, and we will not have this. Now, why is this important in Russian history? The reason this is important is because with the elimination of the Constituent Assembly, democracy in Russia is dead. And that death continues up until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Let me just close that. Now, a few modules back, we talked about the techniques of dictatorships, right? The things that they do which help them gain power. And guys, the Cheka, the secret police that we see in Russia, these were individuals that used force. We said use of force is one of those techniques of dictatorships. And you can see on the screen right here, that is an image of a guy by the name of Felix Dzerzhinsky, known as Iron Felix. And he was the head of the Cheka. He was loyal to Lenin, and he was savage in the repression of people who appear to not be supporting the agenda of the Bolsheviks. So as it mentions on the slide at the top there, the Cheka are agents of terror and repression. And ultimately, guys, why do we make examples of people? Why do we use force? Why do we use terror? Well, ultimately what it does is it creates obedience. So you'll want to know the Cheka as a great example of use of force to create compliance and obedience. So almost immediately after the Constituent Assembly is dissolved, we see Lenin set up the Cheka, and these secret police agents spied on people all across Russia. And if they had to, they would torture, they would arrest, they would execute individuals to end repression against the Bolsheviks. And then probably one of the more important things that the Cheka is involved in is in 1918, someone actually tries to assassinate Lenin. He gets shot in the stomach. And it almost kills him, but in the end he survives it. And this convinces Lenin that they're enemies of the revolution everywhere. And what happens is we see the institution of a campaign known as the Red Terror, where 50,000 people are arrested, executed, and I encourage you to check out this video right here if you haven't already. A lot of people think that because Stalin was so terrible that Lenin just wasn't as bad, and that is absolutely not true. There's a book that I have read, and I'll just show it on the screen right here. It's called Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler and the Age of Social Catastrophe. The first part of the book is about Vladimir Lenin right there. And it definitely blows up that idea that Lenin wasn't so bad. In fact, he was terrible, right? He was terrible. So anyways, moving on. So a quote, right? A quote from the Cheka, from Vice Chairman Peters of the Cheka. You know, if you have a read of this, it's very clear that anyone who opposes Bolshevik power will be dealt with in the most savage of means. Now, moving on. We talked about the promise of Lenin. We talked about peace, land, and bread. Well, guess what? It's time for some peace. So in 1918, once the Bolsheviks had gained their power, we see, guys, the Bolsheviks looking to get Russia out of the war. Now, the treaty that is signed with Germany to get Russia out of the war is known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, why is it called that? Well, because it's signed in Brest-Litovsk, Poland. If you remember your World War I history, there was basically two fronts to the European theater. There was the Western Front, which you would have learned about last year in Social 20, hopefully, where they had the trenches and things like that. If you remember the Battle of Vimy Ridge, right? That was on the Western Front. And then we also had an Eastern Front. To the east, we had basically fighting along the German-Russian border. Now, Lenin knew that, he promised peace, land, and bread to the people of Russia. So this is actually him fulfilling that promise. This is him doing what he said he's going to do. So initially, Germany didn't want to be fighting a two-front war, so they offered Russia an out, right? They offered them this treaty, and Russia initially said no. But as time went on and more Russians continued to die, eventually then Russia comes to Russia comes to Germany and basically says, hey, look, you know what? Like we want out, how about a peace treaty? And this peace treaty is now being dictated by Germany. So on the next slide, you can see all the territory that was lost by Russia in order to get this peace. You can see Russia right here in red. You can see Germany right here in blue. In between it is all this territory that is also controlled by the Tsar. So what Russia gives up in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was Estonia, right, to the north. And then we see Latvia, Lithuania, and then also the nation of Ukraine. And in total, about 60 million people were all of a sudden told now that they are German. Now, don't feel bad. Well, you should feel bad a little bit, but maybe this doesn't last that long. After Germany is defeated and the Treaty of Versailles is signed in 1919, all the territory that Germany gains from World War I is given back. Okay, let's keep going. Now, war, communism. Let's talk about this. So, or the Russian Civil War. We'll talk about that first. So the Russian Civil War. So almost immediately, guys, once the Bolsheviks gain power, we see basically there's a number of people in Russia who aren't happy with the Bolsheviks gaining power. Now, when we talk about civil war, we're talking about war that happens amongst the people of their own nation, right? So during the Russian Civil War, we had two groups. One group were known as the Reds, and one group was known as the Whites. The Reds were the Bolsheviks. They were supporters of Lenin, and then the Whites were a number of different groups. There were anti-communists, there were Democrats, there were monarchists, people who wanted to get the Tsar back on the throne, and then there's even Western powers that were involved in the Russian Civil War. Now, why did the West get involved in Russia's formative civil war? Well, the answer was nations like France and Britain were angry with Russia for leaving them high and dry when it came to World War I. So basically, now that Russia had turned communist and we see Russia no longer participating in World War I, the Allies want to get back at them, right? They want to get back at them for leaving them high and dry. So there's a video there that I encourage you to check out. The thing to remember, guys, and really this plays into the Cold War here, with Western democratic nations becoming involved and trying to stop the Bolsheviks from having power, this plants the seeds for the Cold War, right? Russians don't forget. They don't forget that during their formative civil war, right? Western forces tried to stop the successful Bolshevik communist revolution. So in the end, guys, the Red Army defeats the Whites, and the Reds are led by a guy by the name of Leon Trotsky. And yeah, let's keep going here. So the Civil War lasted about 5 years, right? 1917 and 1922. Began almost immediately after the Bolsheviks took power. In total, it was actually more lives were lost in the Russian Civil War than were actually lost in the Russian participation of World War I, right? Russia lost about 1.8 million soldiers to World War I. This, in fact, was even bloodier, which is kind of crazy, right? Yeah, and as it says at the bottom, this sets the stage for the distrust between the USSR and the West within the post-World War II era, and it largely contributes to the hostility of the Cold War that we see. All right, now, war communism. Let's get through this really quickly here. So in order to have a strong military and have well-fed soldiers, Lenin created an economic policy called war communism. When we think communism, you should think nationalized economy. You should think the means of production being totally concentrated in the hands of government, right? Everything, what to make, how to make it, how to get into the hands of the people, right? Those economic questions that all economies must address. This is now, with war communism, totally in the hands of the Bolsheviks. So the whole point of war communism was to keep the Red Army strong. And as it says, this represents the nationalization of the Russian economy. Now, why does this matter? Well, basically from this point forward, from war communism forward, what we see is Russia is what we call a command economy, right? And who's in command of it? It is the government, right? This is the exact opposite of a free market capitalist economy. So it says the state owned and managed all aspects of the Russian economy. And at this point, capitalism is outlawed. Private ownership is outlawed. There's no more of it. And in the end, the policy is effective, right? We know, guys, that the Reds win the Civil War, right? They win. And a large contributor to it was the fact that the Bolsheviks were controlling all production in order to help them defeat the Whites. Now, there were some people who were not happy about the NEP. That were not happy about war communism. And one group that was not happy about war communism were known as the kulaks. The kulaks were peasant farmers who tend to be profitable, right? They were rich peasant farmers. And rather than giving up their property to the state, a lot of these kulaks actually just destroyed, their plows, or they would kill their livestock and not give it to the state. So Lenin had a choice at this point, right? Do we kill all these people who are the most productive farmers of the Soviet Union? Or do we try to appease them and make them happy so that they will support our war efforts? So in 1921, still in the context of the Russian Civil War, what we see is the creation of something called the New Economic Policy. And I love the naming of it, right? What are we going to call this new economic policy? I got it. How about the New Economic Policy? Anyways, so guys, the NEP was sort of an about face. It reversed some of the total state control of the economy, and what it did introduce was small scale capitalism to to Russia at this point. It's not quite yet the Soviet Union. So it introduced small scale capitalism. So large industry is still controlled by the state. However, small industry, like small farms and small businesses, as long as they met their quotas for production to give to the state to help with the war effort, if they produce beyond those quotas, you could actually take that surplus production and sell it for profit. For profit. That sounds awfully capitalist, doesn't it? And that's because it is. So in the end, guys, what Lenin is trying to do is he's trying to basically entice people to produce more by rewarding them with, as long as you meet your quota, you can then benefit from this production. And it did cause the kulaks to stop rebelling against the Russian Bolshevik Party, and ultimately it did cause production to increase upwards, which is good, right? Which is good. Now, later on down the road, we actually see Stalin, who is the successor of Lenin, criticize this and say that this was a betrayal of communist principles. But in my mind, it was actually a pretty shrewd policy. All right, the death of the Tsar. Let's talk about this. So the death of the Tsar. The Tsar must die for the revolution to live. So guys, with this, during the Russian Civil War, the Tsar was taken as a prisoner of the Reds, and he ended up in a place called Ekaterinburg, Russia. It was a long, long way from St. Petersburg, from Moscow, from any of the major cities. Now, while the whites, again, Russian Civil War is still going on, so the Reds are holding Nicholas II and his family. You can see an image of them right here. As the whites are approaching, what we get, guys, is a white squadron that is looking to free Nicholas and his family. So hastily, the Reds, the Bolsheviks, take him down into the basement. You can see it says place of execution right there. They take him down into the basement, and they decide that, you know what, if Nicholas and his family are captured by the whites, they'll probably put him back on the throne. And what we will get is the end of our glorious revolution. So they kill him. And then we get the formation of the Soviet Union. Sorry, just give me a sec here. We get the formation of the Soviet Union. All right, let's continue here. So the USSR forms under Lenin. So after the Reds win the Civil War, the whites are defeated. All enemies are deposed of, right? They're killed. The Soviet Union is formed. So remember, guys, there is a difference between what we consider to be Russia and what we consider to be the Soviet Union. And what happens, guys, is after the Russian Civil War, all the little republics surrounding Russia, and we'll see that on a map here in a second, all the republics that are surrounding the nation of Russia decide to join with them. They decide that, you know what, this communism stuff sounds pretty good, right? So all these formerly Tsarist held areas come into the fold of the Soviet Union, and we see the creation of the world's first communist sort of super state, right? So not now it's not just Russia, but many other parts to it. And you can see on the screen here, we see the flag of the Soviet Union, right? We can see the hammer right here. The hammer represents the workers. We can see the sickle representing the farmers. Those are the two proletariat classes. And then we see the star. I've always been told that the star represents there's 5 points to the star. It represents the 5 fingers on the hands of the worker. And then, of course, we see the color red, which is it's symbolic of the blood that has been shed trying to overcome bourgeois oppression on the part of the proletariat. So in total, guys, the USSR is composed of 15 different republics. You do not need to know the name of all the different republics that came together to form the USSR. In number 1 right here, that is Russia, right? And you can see all the little different tiny republics surrounding it. So at its peak, guys, the Russian Empire was the 3rd largest empire the world had ever seen. Number 1 was the British Empire. Number 2 was the Mongols. Number 3 were the Russians. And it was massive. It was absolutely massive. How massive? Well, look at this image right here, right? We have a map of the world, and this shows the USSR at the peak of its power during the Cold War, right? All this area in pink was considered Soviet territory. So as you can see, guys, it dwarfed what we consider to be North America, right? Like Mexico, America, and Canada. And yeah, it was we were scared of them. Now, Lenin's death. So in 1924, Lenin has a series of strokes, and eventually, after I think either his third or fourth stroke, he dies, right? And on this slide here, guys, there is a video that would be wise of you to watch. This is the official death announcement of Lenin. So there we have an image of Lenin in hospice after he had his strokes that eventually basically robbed him of the ability to speak or to walk. If you actually visit Red Square in Moscow now, you can actually visit the entombed Lenin for you to pay homage to, which is creepy because his body's now been there for almost 100 years. And yeah, guys, since the death of Lenin, Lenin in life was important. In death, Lenin became basically a mythical figure. So we start to see pro-Lenin propaganda such as this right here. This poster says Lenin was, Lenin is, Lenin will live. So we see this cult of personality that is built up around Vladimir Lenin. He was pretty darn important. And at this point, guys, Russia basically has a question to answer, the Soviet Union has a question to answer. Which way do we go? Do we go down the path of Trotsky? So this is Leon Trotsky right here, or do we go down the path of Joseph Stalin? Now, just so you're aware, on the last slide, it talks about Lenin's testament. Lenin very clearly warned the Bolshevik Party about not trusting Stalin. He did not believe that Stalin could be trusted with power, yet still somehow Stalin gains power. And when we look at Stalin, we'll talk about sort of how he was able to do this. Just so you know, in the end, Trotsky ends up fleeing once Lenin dies and Stalin gains power. Trotsky knows that he probably has a target on his back. Trotsky actually flees to Mexico. He goes into exile in Mexico, and then one day, knock, 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 someone knocks on his door, and it's an assassin who was sent there by Joseph Stalin, and Trotsky dies from an ice pick to the head. So that's how Stalin finally got his comeuppance on Trotsky, as an ice pick to the head. Okay, guys, that is it for our PowerPoint discussion about our friend Lenin and the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union. All right, guys, take it easy. Peace.